Welcome to Passionate World Talk Radio, a subsidiary of Global Media Network, LLC. Our motto is and always will be educate, enlighten, and entertain. And today, on Lest We Forget, our host, Lisa Skinner, will start us off about the atrocities, i.e., massacres of the American Indians, and their first and final stand at Alcatraz.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the show today. Thanks so much for joining us. So this is our third session or third episode of our series, The Genocide of the Native Americans in the United States, when Native Americans were slaughtered in the name of civilization. We talked about this in our first episode, and I want to remind you, because I'm leading up to when Lillian talks about the current today status of the Native American culture, that by the close of the Indian Wars in the late 19th century, fewer than 238,000 Indigenous people remained in the United States. From the time the Europeans arrived on American shores, they decided they didn't want to share the country with the existing Indigenous peoples. So the US government authorized over 1,500 wars, attacks, and raids on the Native Americans, the most any country in the world against its Indigenous people. By the close of the Indian Wars in the late 19th century, the numbers went that were estimated of Native Americans who lived in the United States of America were anywhere from 5 to 15 million people when Columbus arrived in 1492. So even at the low end of 5 million people, by the end of the this whole eradication of the Native American peoples, they had whittled the numbers down, massacred the numbers down to 238,000. And again, what we discovered was the reason for this racial genocide were multi-layered. Settlers, most of whom had been barred from inheriting property in Europe and who arrived on the shores hungry for Indian land and the abundant natural resources that came with it. Plus, another thing that occurred, that they were accused of collusion with the British during the American Revolution and the War of 1812, which only exacerbated American hostility and suspicion toward them. Even more fundamentally, Indigenous people were just too different. We talked about this in our first episode. Their skin was too dark. Their language was too foreign. Their worldviews and spiritual beliefs were beyond what most white men could even comprehend. So settlers developed a fear that a loved one might become one of their victims. And that's pretty much the way they were depicted throughout history. The first time, really, in all those decades of the massacre that occurred, that took the number of Indigenous people from 5 to 15 million to 238,000. Finally, on June 25th of 1876, we've all heard of the Battle of Little Bighorn, also called Custer's Last Stand, where they took a stance against the United States and the Americans for all the murders and assassinations that had taken place. And during these 1,500 Indian wars that occurred during this period of time, a lot of them happened to villages, to people who were unarmed, to women and children. This wasn't necessarily wars between the Native American warriors and the cavalry. They just went in and massacred these villages. And a lot of times only the women and the children were there and were not armed at all. Or the men were there and they were not armed. So events leading up to the confrontation were typical of the irresolute and confusing policy of the United States government toward Native Americans. And although the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie that was signed in 1868, in effect, had guaranteed to the Lakota and Dakota Sioux, as well as the Arapaho Indians, exclusive possession of the Dakota Territory west of the Mississippi River. I'm sorry, west of the Missouri River. But the white miners were in search of the gold that existed there and continued to settle into the lands that were sacred, especially to the Lakota. Unwilling to remove the settlers and unable to persuade the Lakota to sell the territory to the U.S. government, they issued an order to the Indian agencies that all Indians return to their designated reservations by January 31st, 1876, or they would be deemed hostile and would be attacked, and hostilely attacked. The improbability of getting that message to the hunters, coupled with its rejection by many of the Plains Indians, made confrontation inevitable. So, in defiance of the government's threats, the bands of Lakota and Northern Cheyenne Indians, along with a smaller number of Arapaho who had refused to be confined by reservation boundaries, came together under the leadership of Sitting Bull, a charismatic Lakota who called for resistance to U.S. expansion. With the arrival of spring in 1876 and the start of the hunting seasons, many more Indians left their reservations to join Sitting Bull, whose growing numbers of followers were camped on the Little Bighorn River in southern Montana Territory at the end of June. And then on June 25th of 1876, the Battle of Little Bighorn occurred, and they were successful. One of the only times in history where they have taken a stand and actually succeeded in taking that stand against the U.S. government. The outcome of the battle, though it proved to be the height of Indian power, so stunned and enraged white Americans that the government troops, after the Battle of Little Bighorn, flooded the area, forcing the Indians to surrender. So I guess in the end, they really didn't succeed. They succeeded in killing George Custer and his troops, but they were forced out after that. So kind of have the backstory on leading up to what happened in 1969 with the occupation of Alcatraz. So what is that, almost 100 years have gone by, and this group of Native Americans decided once again they're going to take a stance. So the occupation of Alcatraz happened on November 20th, 1969 to June 11th, 1971. It was a 19-month-long protest when 89 Native Americans and their supporters occupied Alcatraz Island right off in San Francisco Bay. The protest was led by Richard Oakes, Lanada Means and others, while John Trudell served as spokesman. The group lived on the island together until the protest was forcibly ended again by the US government. The protest group chose the name Indians of All Tribes for themselves. They claimed that under the Treaty of Fort Laramie between the U.S. and the Lakota tribe that occurred in 1876, I believe, between the U.S. and all retired, abandoned, or out of use federal land was to be returned to the indigenous peoples. So they decided that that land rightfully belonged to them, and they were going to protest the rights to gain it back. And that was the whole purpose behind the occupation of Alcatraz Island. It had a brief effect on federal Indian termination policies and established a precedent for Indian activism. We're talking about 1969 now. Not until then did they establish a precedent for Indian activism. Oakes was shot to death in 1972, and the American Indian movement was later targeted by the federal government and the FBI and placed into the organization, the Counterintelligence Program, where they then spied on them to make sure that they weren't going to continue to resist U.S. government policies. That's basically what came out of the Alcatraz occupation. So to announce their actions to the world, the dissidents issued the Alcatraz Proclamation. The occupiers cited treatment under the Indian termination policy as the reason. They also accused the U.S. of breaking numerous Indian treaties. They said that they intended to take the island over, to build a Native American study center, spiritual center, an ecology center, and an American Indian museum. This is what their intention was for Alcatraz Island, that they believed was rightfully their land under that treaty. Richard Oakes sent a message to the San Francisco Department of the Interior, and this is what he said. We invite the United States to acknowledge the justice of our claim. The choice now lies with the leaders of the American government to use violence upon us as before throughout history to remove us from our Great Spirit's land, or to institute a real change in its dealings with the American Indian. We do not fear your threat to charge us with crimes on our land. We and all other oppressed peoples would welcome spectacle of proof before the world of your title by genocide. Nevertheless, we do seek peace. And I'm going to read to you what they wanted in their proclamation. Excuse me a second. So this is the Alcatraz Proclamation to the Great White Father and his people that they wrote to him in 1969. We, the Native Americans, reclaim the land known as Alcatraz Island in the name of all American Indians by right of discovery. We wish to be fair and honorable in our dealings with the Caucasian inhabitants of this land, and hereby offer the following treaty. We will purchase said Alcatraz Island for $24 in glass beads and red cloth, which happened to be a precedent set by the white man's purchase of a similar island about 300 years earlier. We know that $24 in trade goods for these 16 acres is more than we paid when Manhattan was sold, but we know that land values have risen over the years. Our offer is $1.24 per acre, and that's greater than the 47 cents per acre that the white men are now paying the California Indians for their land. What year is this? 1969. We will give the inhabitants of this land a portion of the land for their own, to be held in trust by the American Indian government for as long as the sun shall rise and the rivers go down to the sea, to be administered by the Bureau of Caucasian Affairs, and we will further guide the inhabitants in the proper way of living. We will offer them our religion, our education, our life ways, in order to help them achieve our level of civilization and thus raise them and all their white brothers up from their savage and unhappy state. We offer this treaty in good faith and wish to be fair and honorable in our dealings with all white men. We feel that this Alcatraz Island is more than suitable as an Indian reservation as determined by the white man's own standards. By this, we mean that the place resembles most Indian reservations in that it is isolated. Now, this is really interesting. It is isolated from modern facilities and without adequate means of transportation. It has no fresh running water. The sanitation facilities are inadequate. There are no oil or mineral rights. There is no industry, and so unemployment is very great. There are no healthcare facilities on Alcatraz Island. The soil is rocky and non-productive, and the land does not support any game. There are no educational facilities. The population has always been held as prisoners and kept dependent upon others. And then finally, they said, further, it would be fitting and symbolic that ships from all over the world entering the Golden Gate would first see Indian land and thus be reminded of the true history of this nation. This tiny island would be a symbol of the great lands once ruled by free and noble Indians. And this is all they were asking for, was to have a place they could call their own, but they believed that it already rightfully, based on the Laramie Treaty that had been signed by the government and the Indian nations, belonged to them. Did they succeed? They occupied Alcatraz Island for 19 months, and then they were finally forced off. Lillian?
So we can see that the U.S. government will never admit they made a mistake or they were prejudiced and they were in the wrong, which doesn't quite surprise me. Also, in the same line, we're going to discuss about Native American Indian women. Like the white history of this country, you rarely hear about the women. There are only two Indians women who really became famous. One was Pocahontas because she married a white dude, and the other one was Seneca because she helped out Lewis and Clark. But both of these ladies lost big time. First, from being severed from their roots, which we white people seem to put a lot of stock in. I have a former friend who could trace her ancestry all the way back to Adam and Eve. Much good it ever did her, but then again, it was very important that she could trace it all the way back to Adam and Eve. However, I'm not so much going to read it, but I am going to tell you all the Native American women warriors. Now, in our society, women who try to be men are bullied, are killed, are physically abused, not to mention mentally abused. In the indigenous tribes, they did not look at genders who did not stay within their gender pool as a no-no. No one had to come out of the closet. No one was in prison for it. Nobody was killed for that. All the Indians acknowledged was that a woman had a man's spirit in her, which meant she still dressed like a woman, but in every respect, she was a warrior. Or she dressed up as a warrior and never took a husband. So these are the list of ladies who I have found among the different Native American Indian tribes that rose to prominent positions, becoming medicine men, chiefs, and warriors that were given great accolades by their people and fighting the bad men. And the bad men was either the U.S. cavalry, the military at that point, the fur traders, or the settlers. The first one I came across is Curran. She died in 1966. Her name was Wilma Mankiller. Mankiller was a name that went back a couple of hundred years to her ancestors, and it meant that they were successful when killing. They do not say men or women or children. And she was very revered. She was the first feminist pioneer and future advocate for the Indian tribes. She died at 64 in 2010. The next one is Millie Thompson Williams, who is also known as Wilma Mankiller. The next one was called Run for Governor, Paulette. She ran for the governorship in 2018. That was only, 5 years ago? And she received 40% of the vote. Then we have Biden, who selected Representative Deb Haaland, Haaland, and she was elected to Congress. And then she was made U.S. Interior Secretary by Biden. Then we have Marilyn Malibu, who was famous Indian lady, and she encountered Chris Columbus in 1492, and she negotiated with him not to take the lands from her people, and he agreed. But as soon as she died, all bets were off, and he seized the land and proclaimed it for Spain. Then you have Harleen Taters, Teters, and she was an activist, only instead of political activist, she showed it in her art. Then you have a woman by the name of Running Eagle. And forgive me if I don't get the pronunciation correct. It's Pindamaka Ata Onakin. And she dressed as a boy, and her father was so impressed by her minor hunting skills that he took her aside and taught her everything she needed to know about being a warrior. And she was so good at it that they renamed her Running Eagle from her regular woman's name. Then you have Sue Santa Flesh Picate, and she was the first Indian, Native American Indian, to become a doctor. She went to the medical school in Philadelphia and studied, and she received permission and her degree to be a medical doctor, not only within the Native American community, but also among the white community. because she combined her herbal skills, which she was taught, and combined it with white man's modern medicine. Then you have Molly Brant, who was a Mohawk in 1736, and she was a medicine woman and warrior. Then you have Queen Aliquippa, who was, in a sense, a warrior, a chief. George Washington was so impressed with her at her skills of delegating and leading her nation that when he was up there with the British, he paid a call and paid tribute to her. Bet you don't hear that every single day, do you? A white man doing that. Then you have Annie Dodge from the Navajo Nation. And she fought against in 1670. And she was the first female Sachem chief, which meant she was spiritual chief. Sachem is like the wampum that they give out for when they may talk to other people for peace treaties and for spiritualness of the tribe, which is a very unique position for a woman to attain. It's usually only given to a male warrior. Alice Brown led the Seminole of Oklahoma, and she was famous for her warrior and leadership. Then you have Colas Dye, who was a chief, and the story is she fought by her husband's side during a conflict between another tribe, and when he died, she took up his rifle and killed as many enemy as she possibly could. So she is also revered. Then you have Buffalo Calf Road Women, who was a Cheyenne warrior. She fought in the Battle of Little Bighorn. It is stated that Custard was killed with a bullet, and she was one of the Indian warriors that had a 6-shooter, and she shot him in his face, knowing that was the worst disgrace he could ever have, because that meant it robbed him not only of his handsomeness, but he would have no eyes to take him into the great white beyond. So she did that on purpose. It was her mark of contempt for him. Then you have Nanhee, she who walks among the spirits, and she is from the Cherokee tribe, 1738. Then you have Sarah Winnemucca of the Puyallup tribe, and she was a scout and messenger during the Bannock War. Then you have Datesti of the Chacopin Apache tribe in New Mexico, and she was also known as Two-Spirit. She was a superb warrior and hunter. Then you had all Ashanks of the Sakonay tribe, 1620, and she arranged a peace treaty between the Indians and Plymouth Colony. It's funny they didn't teach us that when we were talking about the Pilgrims coming and establishing a colony in Plymouth. And she was also present during King Philip's War. Then you have Annie Dodge of the Navajo community, and she is a tribal leader. And she was the first Indian woman in 1951 to be awarded the Presidential Freedom Medal. Gee, I wonder why they forgot to mention that too. And then you have Moving Robe, woman of Hunkapaka, which is a Sioux tribe. And she was also at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and she had a knife, and she stabbed Custard in the back. So if you're interested in any of these women who all had men spirits, and even though they were women, they acted like men, please contact me at twrnetworkllc@gmail.com so you can learn more about these women of the Native American Indian tribes. It's important for you to realize that women had men spirits and that they demanded to be heard in a patriarchal society, which was even more rigid and structured than the white society. It was unheard of for women to do anything but be beasts of baggage, become pregnant, and keep the home fires burning. And the fact that these ladies decided that they weren't going to stick with the role assigned to them by the warrior men tells me a lot about the Indian culture that we are never taught about. Betsy?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Lillian, for all your wonderful information. And thank you, Lisa, for your information. For some reason, folks, I forgot to write notes, my notes for today's show. So I apologize for that. It's been crazy in my house. But I do have some things to say. I didn't know about the stand for Alcatraz in 1969. I don't even remember hearing about it, seeing it on the news. And in 1969, I was I was 11. So I just don't even remember it. So when I watched the video on YouTube, I was like, wow, I don't even remember this. And we weren't taught the true history of what went on with the Native Americans, as Lillian had mentioned. And it was mind-boggling because I had watched a video about Hawaii and Alaska, and it just still boggles my mind. I think it always will, that America, I love America, don't get me wrong, it's the greatest country in the world. We did a Holocaust here, folks. We killed the Native Americans. As Lisa mentioned, you went from 5 to 15 million to 200, if I can read my handwriting, 3 to 2, wait a minute, 2000, no, 23, I can't talk today. What is it, Lisa? 238,000.
238,000.
Woo! Can't get my words out today, folks. Okay. That's a Holocaust, folks. I don't care what you have to say about that, really. You get insulted about it or think I'm a terrible American about it. Facts are facts. And this is a sad commentary on what went on. And I meant to keep the article about the new stamp that just came out that honored one of the Native American chiefs. And there was an article about it. You probably could Google it, the new U.S. stamp that came out. And, you know, it's all about, I think, greed. People want land. Land is wealth. There was gold on there, minerals, and people get greedy and they're not satisfied, so they want more. They killed colonists, people that went out west, killed these innocent people because they wanted their land. And again, I had to tell the audience, ask the audience, how would you feel if you tended to your land, you took care of it for years, it was in your family for years, and someone comes along and says, get out. I don't like that you're taking this land. I want it for myself. And not being liked or given a chance because of the color of your skin, your religion, or your culture. This is what happened here in the States. No different, really, in a way, from Hitler, what he did to the Jews and other people in Europe. What was it about? Fear, greed, and thinking that people are subhuman. Well, the colonial people thought that the Native Americans were subhuman. So they killed them. And that's really a disgrace. I have to talk about, because I thought about our show, lest we forget. I was watching an episode of Here Come the Brides, and that was back in 1967, 68. And this particular episode was about a Native American young boy. His family was killed, and they found him. He knew who killed his family, but right away, the white people, the Caucasian people, took this young boy in, thought he was a wild savage, because that's what they said, cut his hair, and tried to not convert him, but try to, I guess, make him in their eyes civilized. But they eventually let him go back to his tribe. Excuse me. And then, as we had discussed before, Hollywood's image of the Native Americans. And when I watched this episode, I thought of Lisa and how she mentioned about Hollywood and the image. And I had mentioned that. And this is what was portrayed, being savages, being wild. This young boy went to kill someone who killed his family, but they thought he was just being, quote, wild Indian, wild savage, as they would call him. He wanted to revenge his family's murder. It is, again, a sad commentary on American history. We're not taught the everything about what went on in America. And I have learned so much on doing this show from Lillian and Lisa of what I have researched, looking at YouTube, excuse me, a lot. I'm even sharing it with my mother, what I learned from doing the show. It really opened up my eyes to history that I did not know about, because we were not taught that. It certainly wasn't in books. I heard of Trail of Tears. I know from reading various books that the Native Americans would move in different times of the year, move down south in the colder, winter months, then move back out north in when it's summer. And they, white men, for lack of a better word, also killed their bison as revenge. And they didn't have, as Lisa said, running water. They did not have the luxuries that the white Americans had, the colonial people, whatever you want to call them. I've said this before, and I'm going to keep saying it, folks. We have to stop the hate. We have to stop the stigma. All people want, everybody, I don't care who you are, what you are, we want our families to be safe. We want a roof over our heads. We want food. We want shelter. We want to live in peace. So why is that so hard? Nate, that's a call to action. Email me at sloanbetsy31@gmail.com and tell me, why is it so hard for us to live in peace? We need to start embracing each other. We're more alike than we are different. If someone has a different color skin than you, a different religion, different sexual preference, that doesn't make them a terrible person, and you don't have to agree with it. No one is asking anyone to embrace a lifestyle, embrace a religion. We're just asking the world. I am. Stop the hate. I say I use my show, Chatting with Betsy, to try to change the world. Well, here, unless we forget, we're trying to change the world. We want to bring back humanity, brotherhood, and love. And yes, I know I sound like a child of the 60s over here. But, cut us open. We bleed red blood. We all do. And we all want the same things for ourselves and our families. So why can't we just, sound like Rodney King here, get along? Why can't we just put our differences aside? So what somebody likes, women if they're a woman, or they're gay, transgender, whatever. You don't have to like it. You don't have to agree with it, but that doesn't give anyone the right to belittle someone, judge someone, bully them, and kill them and hurt them. Nobody has a right to do that to another human being. And that might not get me popular. I don't care. I'm a Jersey girl. I say it like it is. My father's daughter. And that's what I have to say today. Thank you.
You know, Betsy, what you said made me think about one aspect, because have all been painted this portrait of the Native American Indians through Hollywood, like you said, like we've said on a couple of these episodes. And until the three of us really started digging deep into what actually occurred, and it does definitely resemble a Holocaust. What do you think, Lillian, about the image that Hollywood has really portrayed the American Indians to be as savages, as murderers? Do you think that maybe that was done intentionally through pressure by the government to justify the truth that we've uncovered about the millions and millions of Native Americans who were murdered for the sake of civilization, as we've said, because we wanted their land?
Well,
Go ahead.
I was just going to add too that the number one killer among the Indians was and has been alcohol. They have no capacity for whatever the reason. They cannot drink alcohol. It does terrible things to them.
They're missing a gene or something.
They're missing a gene or something. And because of that, the white man pretty much used that. And then the second thing was VD. Every time a white person with their crew went somewhere in the world, they would have sex. Men have needs. Well, I got to tell you something, so do women, but you won't like what I have to say about that. However, moving along. And so men would sleep with these, what they consider savages, but they had needs. So that always sort of confused me, because I remember talking to a gentleman who had gotten out of Vietnam. And I said, so did you sleep with the ladies over there? And he looked like I had slapped him in the face. He says, you don't sleep with the enemy. They're savages. They're not human. You don't sleep with someone who's not your kind. So I don't know whether it made me feel better that he didn't slap around to give them VD, or his attitude towards these people who he considered vermin. But I do know that white sailors, and it can be any nationality, folks, has this conviction that they have a right to rape and plunder the people who they encounter on the shores, because they're white, and the people that they're controlling, taking over, enslaving is not. I mean, the English weren't the only game in town. The Portuguese were doing it. The Spanish were doing it. Even Rome did it to expand its empire. And if you look at even among the popular TV thing of Game of Thrones, which now they relate to almost everything, you can pretty much relate to here, is that people believe since they're the most powerful, they have the most weapons, they have the most warriors, they're the strongest. It gives them the right to take at any cost. And I believe that even if brown-skinned Indians from India came over, or dark-skinned Africans came over, they would feel a threat from the brown-skinned Indians. They would do the same thing. And that's what's scary to me, folks. It's just not a white person's problem. All humans, yellow, green, purple, blue. Today, I read an article about the Chinese government and how they're making war against the United States. And it's not through nuclear weapons. Oh, no, it's a lot more sneakier than that. They're talking about the Chinese and their companies, or companies that they're partnering with white guys who are buying up land in the United States for farming and for manufacturing. And the fact that it will give these Chinese the ability to spy on us, to be able to take from what rightfully belongs to the United States. Do you see where I'm going with this? So you don't have to start a war. It's the very nature of man himself that makes us destructive if somebody gets in our way once we make up their mind that it's ours. I'll give you one more example. Have you ever watched a bunch of toddlers in a sandbox or playing in somebody's living room or even in the room, and it starts out pretty quiet and all the grown-ups are really happy and they keep on drinking their coffee and talking about and showing pictures, and then next thing you know, nuclear fallout in that whatever area of space is because John snatched the truck from Jim and Annabelle thinks it's hers, and Ed is stamping his feet and saying, mine, 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 where Bruce is saying and snatching it, no, it's my turn. And then you have one lone kid in the middle saying, can't we just get along? And these are kids between the ages of 2 and 3. They're toddlers and they don't know any better, but they're exhibiting the same traits that the adults exhibit. NATO, the UN, Putin, Ukraine. Ring a bell, folks? This is my land. You can't have it. Oh, no, it belongs to us. Well, we're going to go over to your nuclear place and take it away from you. Oh, no, you're not. That really belongs to us. We're China and we're the big bad wolf. Oh, no, we're Indian. We have more people, so we have a right. If the biblical stories are true and God made everybody start speaking a language nobody else understood, so they all left in anger, it's too bad he hasn't come down to make sure everybody is speaking or acting a different way, so everybody just goes home to nurse their pride and their sense of ownership and all the ugly words that come out. I think the thing that's most striking is that in a lot of the books now that are putting love stories in Regency and the Victorian era, they all say the same things. Duels are against the law. You don't have the right to slap anybody with your glove and then go out and kill them. Oh, I don't know about that. We don't deal with guns anymore, folks. We deal with nuclear weapons. We deal with drones. We deal with chemical warfare. We deal with drugs. The stakes are a lot higher, but we're still dueling. So what do? Well, as a call to action for me, why don't you tell us what you think should be done? After all, if enough of us get together, our governments might even pay attention to us. Maybe we should boycott them. Maybe we should tell them, instead of digging into Social Security and Medicare, that they should take away the allowance that they vote themselves every year for doing absolutely nothing but sitting on their big butts. So please let me know. pwrnetworkllc@gmail.com. And if there's something in your family tree that you feel should not be forgotten, let us know about that as well. Lisa?
I think for our final and fourth episode of the Native American series that we've been doing, we should close this out next week by bringing everybody up to date on the current status of the Native American culture. Because what we've talked about is the genocide and the millions of people that are no longer walking this earth or breathing this air as a result of all of the wars. And they've taken, you know, a couple of stances to really stand by their rights, the Battle of Little Bighorn and Alcatraz, but what's happened to them since then? Currently, I think that's going to be a great topic to close this series out, because to be honest with you, you never hear about Native Americans than in relationship to their casinos that have cropped up all over the United States. So is that a good thing for them, or is it not such a good thing for them? Because are we trying to take that away from them too? Let's do the research and find out what is happening with this culture today. I'm really curious to know what is going on. So my personal email is dementiawhisperer1@gmail.com. Send me a message. I'd love to hear from you, and I really hope you're enjoying the information that we are bringing to you each week. Thank you.
And one more thought, maybe you would like to tell us how you feel about the efforts that the American Indians, not only just within the lower 48, but also in Alaska and Hawaii, which you hear nothing about, because climate change is making a change with the Indians who live in Alaska. And since many of the indigenous tribes depend on the ocean to supply them with their needs, it's something that us whites really ought to start thinking about, how what the doom that we have brought upon our planet is now affecting them as well. So please let us know. The three of us can't make any changes by ourselves. It's a worldwide effort. So again, contact me at pwrnetworkllc@gmail.com. We want to thank you all for listening to us this afternoon, and understand that you'll see the video on youtube.com/PWR Network _PW Talk Radio at https://passionateworldtalkradio.com, and also on Spreaker and iHeart and iTunes and 20 other directories that are all listed at the website. So have a great weekend. Take a good look around and tell us what you think. Thank you all very much. And remember, have a great week.